Differentiating Objective and Subjective Countertransference by Paul Geltner. Part 2. Searching for congruence between content and countertransference, a preliminary example. As previously mentioned, there are a number of different ways in which the countertransference can be congruent with the content, and these are intrinsically related to the various types of countertransference that will be delineated in the following chapters. For present purposes, however, we will not attempt to classify the specific type of congruence, but rather will use the different forms of congruence as a set of guidelines for identifying areas of congruence anywhere in the material. The task is to compare this feeling to the patient's words, to the facts she describes, to her affective tone, and to the countertransference. I have outlined the process as a sequence, but in real life, no such sequence is necessary. It doesn't matter where the analyst begins or what order she follows. We will begin with a simple, single countertransference feeling. The analyst feels like a failure as an analyst. She doesn't feel like she's very good at what she does. The feeling is of a moderate intensity. She isn't completely preoccupied with the feeling, but it comes up regularly when she is with the patient. Thus, we know the specific feeling, failure, and we know the intensity. We do not know the relational mode, which is to say that when we consider the feeling of failure, we do not know how the analyst is experiencing herself in relationship to the patient. Thus, we will examine the feeling in the context of different modes of relatedness. We should first ask whether the feeling might be experienced within a narcissistic relational mode, which would mean that the analyst has the same feeling as the patient. Let's look for obvious similarities between the analyst's feeling of failure and the patient's feeling about herself. Does the patient say, either overtly or covertly, that she feels like a failure in her life? If not, does she say that she feels like a failure in some area of her life, whether it is as big as her marriage or as small as a frustrating phone call to customer service at a credit card company? Does the feeling of failure come up in her dreams? Does she describe other people in her life, friends, relatives, and politicians, as failures in a way that suggests that she feels a kinship with them? Do other people treat her like a failure, or does she feel that they do? Does she express analogous feelings, such as powerlessness, impotence, or weakness, or ascribe them to others? If no clear similarities emerge, consider whether the feeling of failure is being experienced in the object relational mode, in which the analyst and the patient would have different feelings, but would be logically related to each other. Is the patient constantly reassuring the analyst, or does she describe reassuring others in her life? Does the patient make a lot of demands on the analyst or on others in her life? Does she feel disappointed in what others do for her? Does she make suggestions to the analyst in ways that undermine the analyst's confidence? Does she insinuate that her friends in therapy are making tremendous progress, more than she is? This particular form of congruence, object congruence, is often difficult to locate because almost any feeling can be the counterpart of any other feeling within the context of an interpersonal relationship. The analyst must always listen for any evidence that anyone else in the patient's life feels like a failure in the context of their relationship with the patient. Another possibility is that the feeling of failure is the product of a projective identification, in which case the feeling would be the polar opposite of the patient's feeling. Is the patient confident or overly confident? Does she brag about her successes? Is she grandiose? At times this can be very subtle, only emerging after a very long time. One patient with whom I felt like a failure was not overly grandiose about herself, but she constantly talked about her relationships with celebrities. Does she present her life story as a heroic struggle in which she always wins, or as an epic failure in which she wins by suffering the most? Does she describe situations in which she should feel like a failure, but somehow manages to give a positive spin? Does she refer to others as failures, losers, or wimps? Does she seem like she always gets what she wants? Finally, we need to consider whether the feeling could be experienced in an analytic relational mode, which is to say, as a feeling the patient needs in order to mature. For example, the patient might need the analyst to feel like a failure in order to help her distinguish the analyst from a parental figure, not in the sense of denigrating or devaluing her, but rather in the sense of accepting that she is not an idealized figure that she cannot hope to live up to. Now, let us consider the affective tone, looking for similarities, again starting with the narcissistic mode. Does she sound like a failure, depleted, hesitant, or resigned? Is her tone self-lacerating, even if her words express confidence or realism? Is there anything at all in the tone, perceptible if not describable, that harmonizes with the feeling of failure? Any of these would suggest a degree of congruence based in the narcissistic relational mode. And if not, look for a feeling tone that is the counterpart or the opposite of the feeling, either the object mode or the projective identification mode. Is there anything in her tone that is demeaning, haughty, or contemptuous? Does she sound impatient or condescendingly patient? Does she compliment the analyst from a position of superiority? Is there anything in the patient's interaction with that analyst that could be discouraging? Does she denigrate therapy in general, or doctors, or other professionals as quacks or charlatans? Does the patient say yes, but to everything the analyst says, stating or implying that there is something wrong with all of her comments, that they always miss the mark? Does she feel consistently misunderstood by the analyst? Does the patient agree with the analyst while always taking the point a step further in a subtle manifestation of competitive one-upmanship? Does she refer to a friend who is making astonishing progress in her life or in her therapy without overtly complaining about her progress or her life? Does she praise the analyst's comments while remaining curiously unaffected by them? Any of these ways of relating to the analyst could induce feelings of failure in the countertransference in the object relational mode. It is remarkable how often these types of questions reveal the parallels between the analyst's feelings and the patterns in the patient's life. When I listen to cases in supervision, or when I myself am describing my cases in supervision, I'm often astonished at how frequently the congruence is right on the surface of the material. When the analyst can describe the feelings she has about or with the patient, even a little bit, and discuss the case in an open-ended way, the congruencies are often luminous. Of course, the congruence is easiest to see when its similarity with the content is detailed and explicit. If not, the material needs to be examined more carefully in order to perceive the similarity. At times, the problem is separating the global feeling from the specific context in which the analyst experiences it. For example, a supervisee described a case in which she felt critical of a patient for being somewhat sneaky and dishonest with her. The analyst thought the countertransference was subjective because the patient never reported that anyone had said anything similar to her, nor was this a complaint that she had about others. While this was true, a closer study of the patient's communications revealed that almost everyone in the patient's life was critical of her for some circumscribed aspect of how she related. Some felt that she was irresponsible, some that she was pushy, and others felt that she was disingenuous. But everyone was critical of something. The relevant component of the countertransference, the part that correlated to the patient's repetition, was not the idea that the patient was sneaky, but rather that the analyst felt critical of her for any reason. In all of this, it is most important not to dismiss any similarity as mere coincidence, no matter how seemingly irrelevant it seems to the thrust of the content. Many times an association that appeared to be no more than a distracting tangent will bloom into a full-blown pattern provided the analyst keeps listening for it. The point is to listen for anything anywhere in the material that resonates on any level with the feeling in the countertransference. The analyst builds up an increasingly complete understanding of the countertransference repetition by sifting through the mass of associations, memories, fantasies, and behaviors. The intelligibility of the countertransference emerges by passing the totality of the patient's communications through the sieve of the analyst's feelings. What is left over usually pops out vividly. Unfortunately, the congruence is not always obvious. Sometimes it must be extracted more laboriously from the ore of the patient's material. This can be seen in cases in which the congruence lies not in the specific feeling the analyst experiences, but in relational interactions derived from feelings the analyst acts in or enacts with the patient. For example, let's go back to the feeling of failure in the countertransference. Suppose there's nothing in particular that seems to cause the analyst to feel like a failure. A careful study of the material reveals no specific congruence with the content of the sessions. But let's also suppose that the analyst's feeling of failure leads her to relate to the patient in a way that causes the patient to behave impulsively. At first glance, it appears that the analyst's feeling of failure induces an impulsive reaction in the patient, and this, of course, might be the case. However, as the analyst listens further, she finds that the patient becomes impulsive after numerous interactions in which the other person has any emotional reaction to the patient's behavior. When he discusses his career with his father gets annoyed, and the patient becomes impulsive. When he talks to his boyfriend about plans for the summer, the boyfriend gets obsessive, and the patient becomes impulsive. When he talks to his boss about his performance, the boss makes some recommendations, and the patient becomes impulsive. What do we have here? We see the beginnings of a pattern. After having received a range of communications from others, superficially motivated by a number of different feelings, the patient becomes impulsive. Although the patient does not consciously experience these communications as problematic, they seem to have a problematic effect on him. His impulsivity creates serious problems for him in many areas of his life. Vague as the pattern is at this point, it is too serious to be dismissed as coincidence. Here, the specific conscious countertransference is not the salient issue in the repetition. It is simply one of the feelings that other people experience in relationship to the patient that leads to an interaction that causes him to become impulsive. The congruence lies in this pattern of interaction, not the specific feeling that any one particular person has about the patient's behavior. But what sets the process in motion? How is it that each person experiences different feelings that all have the same effect on the patient? The patient has clearly induced something in all of them, a propensity to relate to him in an unsatisfying way, which leads to the same result. But it is not possible to see this pattern more clearly because it is incongruent with what the patient is overtly saying, doing, or feeling in the session. Incongruence. Countertransference is incongruent with the content to the extent that there are no evident similarities, parallels, or analogies between the countertransference and the content. Whereas congruence is a source of information about the relationship between the content and the countertransference, incongruence is a source of puzzles and questions. In general, the analyst's confusion, both emotional and intellectual, is directly proportionate to the degree of incongruence in the countertransference. Things are fairly simple when the countertransference is incongruent with only one component of the content. Consider the situation in which the analyst dislikes the patient intensely, and suppose that the patient's words are friendly, but his tone of voice is belligerent. The induction is incongruent with the patient's words, but congruent with his effective tone. The countertransference is an obvious induction from one part of the patient's communication, but not all of it. The situation is more complex when the countertransference is incongruent with both the words and the language, but congruent with other facts the patient reports. Consider again a scenario in which the analyst dislikes the patient. But this time, suppose that there is nothing offensive in the patient's presentation. He is friendly, gentle, and cooperative. However, the patient also reports that other people dislike, mistreat, or reject him. The countertransference is congruent with these facts, which suggests that it is definitely a repetitive induction. The confusion is caused by the incongruence of the feelings with the patient's overt mode of relating to the analyst. It is impossible to see what the patient is doing that induces the countertransference. The process is too subtle to identify. The most confusing configuration occurs when the countertransference is completely incongruent with the content. Nothing in the countertransference seems remotely related to what the patient is doing or saying. In this case, the analyst dislikes the patient, but there is nothing in the content that suggests a resonance. The patient is not only friendly, gentle, and cooperative, but he reports that everyone likes him and appreciates him. The patient describes other problems, of course. Why else would he be in analysis? But there is no evident link to the analyst's feeling of disliking him. To some extent, this is a matter of how closely the material has been studied. It is always possible that the analyst has misidentified the countertransference feeling, overlooked details in the content, or ignored the patient's overt tone. The analyst may be blind to congruencies that are obvious to his supervisor or colleagues, or even to the analyst herself after careful reflection. Nevertheless, at some point, it must be acknowledged that there isn't any comprehensible relationship between what the analyst is feeling and what the patient is doing or saying in the sessions, at least within the limitations of ordinary human intelligence. There are two possible explanations for incongruence. One, of course, is that the countertransference is not an induction, but rather a purely subjective response that contains no information about the patient. The other explanation is that there is a cleavage between the feelings communicated through induction and those communicated through talking and the more overt forms of relating. There's probably a certain amount of biological variation in this area, as in all areas, with some people exhibiting more incongruence between their inductions and language, independent of dynamic issues, than others. For the most part, however, incongruence is due to the operation of defenses. Incongruent inductions of this sort are often at the core of the patient's problems. Their origins are rooted in the earliest phases of pre-verbal development and underlie the most tenacious repetitions. Although they are incongruent with material the patient has consciously verbalized, they are actually congruent with unconscious feelings, impulses, or memories. This usually becomes apparent over time, as the analytic process modifies the defenses and the patient comes to tolerate and verbalize the unconscious feelings and memories. However, the analyst must wait, often for a long time, for the material that reveals the hidden congruence. Understanding incongruent inductions. The analyst's understanding of incongruent countertransference will be less certain than of congruent countertransference, and it is always possible that it is subjective. But the subjective explanation should be the last one to be seriously considered. As a working hypothesis, all countertransference, both congruent and incongruent, should be treated as potentially objective until proven otherwise. The first step in analyzing an incongruent countertransference is to place it in the context of the analyst's emotional life history. Is the feeling characteristic of the analyst's patterns of relating, or is it distinctive? Although most feelings the analyst experiences will be familiar, some are unique, and these are usually objective. For example, one analyst experienced an uncharacteristic difficulty talking whenever she was with a particular patient. She made slips of the tongue, had trouble finding words, and sometimes stuttered. She felt extremely unnerved by this incompetency. She had never had this type of confusion before. Her verbal communication was normally flawless. The problem arose as soon as the patient came into the office and abetted when he left. It also occurred when she discussed the patient in supervision. This difficulty must have had a subjective root somewhere. If the analyst weren't capable of feeling it, the patient would not have been able to induce it. The fact that it was so distinct from anything the analyst had ever felt and was so regularly linked to a particular patient suggested that it was induced. This was confirmed later in the analysis when the patient revealed that she had stuttered as a child, which had been extremely painful. She had learned to overcome the stuttering almost completely. The only shadow of it that remained was a subtle deliberateness in her speech. But the memories had left her with a profound feeling of vulnerability and incompetence, which the analyst experienced through the induction. Even if the countertransference feeling is familiar, and even if it might be expected to occur in the context of what is happening in the moment between the patient and the analyst, its intensity can signal that it is an induction. Once I became annoyed with a patient who was tentatively boasting about a recent accomplishment. This woman was a timid and reluctant braggart, if there ever was one. Indeed, we had recently worked on helping her to appreciate her abilities more fully, and this was the first time she had tried it out. Yet I was irritated at that moment by what I felt was her grandiosity. Now, it is not unlike me to be irritated by overt grandiosity, but my reaction was not only inconsistent with the main thrust of my feelings about her and the goals of our work, but it was completely out of proportion to how she actually expressed herself. This appeared to be an induction, and was confirmed as such in the months that followed when she described her parents' hostility towards anything that resembled, no matter how lightly, pride or exhibitionism. Finally, what about situations in which the analyst's feelings are familiar and might be expected to arise at the intensity at which she experiences them? Here, it is beginning to look as if the feeling is an idiosyncratic subjective reaction, particularly if it is experienced only one time, rather than an induction. However, if it is a regular and repetitive feature of the analyst's feelings about the patient, I would still be reluctant to dismiss the possibility that it is induced. I would continue listening, for years if need be, for congruent material in the content. Sexual arousal, for example, has not been a unique or unusual feeling in my life, but with one schizophrenic patient, it seemed to be a more idiosyncratic response. She had been hospitalized for at least 30 years. She was disheveled and smelled bad, and spent most of her time sitting in a chair and muttering. Although she could talk, our range of topics was limited. When I asked what she liked to eat, she told me that she liked what was in refrigerators. I wasn't able to determine whether this meant that she liked cold food, or if this just best described the foods that she did like. There was nothing seductive or flirtatious in her behavior. Nevertheless, following a period in which very little seemed to be going on in the treatment, we had a session in which I had a number of very exciting sexual fantasies about her, which had a strong sense of taboo. While I would not rule out the possibility of having fantasies about her unrelated to her life story, the conditions in which we met, the hospital day room, her overall appearance and odor, the level of our verbal communications, were not consistent with my own erotic patterns. This suggests that the feelings were induced. However, there was no material in the content of the sessions that supported this hypothesis. So my countertransference remained incongruent with the content. There was a note in her chart that indicated a possible history of sexual abuse, which, particularly in light of the taboo feelings in my fantasies, also suggests that these feelings may have been induced. However, this information was not certain. In any case, if I had continued to work with her, I would have continued to search the content of the sessions for material that might be congruent with the countertransference. Time and again, I have analyzed countertransference, my own and my supervisor's, that initially appeared rooted in the analyst's life history that eventually was revealed to be an undistorted repetition from the patient's history. And I have rarely seen the converse. Idiosyncratic subjective responses to patients do occur frequently, and they can certainly be potent sources of distortion, but they are usually much less prominent in the countertransference than has traditionally been assumed. The analyst is seldom alone with her feelings when she is working with the patient. Enactments. In enactments, an interpersonal dynamic from the patient's past is repeated in the current interaction between the patient and the analyst, not just on the level of feeling, but in overt behavior. For example, if a patient's experience of being emotionally abused by his father is enacted in the treatment, the analyst does not just feel the father's abusive feelings. She actually behaves abusively towards the patient. This is not to say that the analyst's behavior is exactly the same as the original object's behavior. It is usually a symbolic analog. Nor does it mean that the intensity is the same. It is usually significantly attenuated. But the behavior is real. It's not just a feeling, and it expresses the same feelings and meanings in the current relationship as the original object's behavior did in the original relationship. This can be seen in the following example of a low-key enactment. A patient came in over a period of several weeks and complained about a number of calamities in his life. He was having trouble at work, his boyfriend was cheating on him, and he had lost control of his spending. My countertransference feeling was that I was numb with all of this. Although I sympathized with his problems in a sort of abstract way, they really didn't move me. I realized that I also became preoccupied with my own thoughts and problems when he was talking. In a subtle, yet very real sense, I was neglecting him. He needed me, as I subsequently understood, to take an active concern for what was going on, and I was lying back and free associating as the spectacle of his life unfolded. Once I realized what I was doing, the meaning of it all was obvious. His mother had been frequently depressed when he was young and usually unresponsive to his needs and problems. She often forgot to make him meals, do his laundry, rake him to the dentist, or get him a haircut. On a symbolic level, my neglect was a repetition of her neglect. But I had gone beyond just feeling neglectful. Through my passivity, I had actually neglected him, not in the way that a mother can neglect a young child, but in the way that an analyst can neglect a patient. But here's the rub. It is probably impossible for the analyst to experience any feeling without expressing it to some degree in behavior. In this case, my actions went over the line to the point that they were visible. But they had been there on a more shadowy level at other points in the treatment as well. We talk about feeling a feeling without acting on it, but this process is never leak-proof. Furthermore, the analyst may not know what she is feeling until after she has acted on it and can read her feelings in his actions. Induction is a powerful, unconscious process that always leaves the analyst a few steps behind. She will always be acting on the countertransference, sometimes visibly, sometimes imperceptibly. For this reason, I do not find it helpful to distinguish between objective countertransference and enactments, and I use the term countertransference because it is more consistent with my overall theoretical framework. However, When the analyst expresses her feelings too floridly in behavior, she crosses the qualitative line, separating countertransference/enactment from acting out. How much action is too much? Analysts of different orientations are sure to disagree. From my perspective, the line has been crossed under 3 conditions. A. The analyst is conscious of the meaning of her behavior in the context of the patient's life, and she has made no effort to modify her behavior to meet the patient's analytic needs. B. She has decided not to make the effort, or C. She grossly violates an important ethical standard of practice, such as having sex with the patient.